Happiness has a shelf life. You know this already, even if you've never thought about it in quite these terms. You get the promotion, the relationship, the apartment with the good light, and for a while, everything feels different, better. Then one morning you wake up and it's just your life again. The question isn't whether this happens. The question is why. The answer lives in your brain's reward circuitry, in the chemical conversations happening between neurons, in systems that evolved long before anyone conceived of promotions or apartments with good light. These systems are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. That's the uncomfortable part. Start with dopamine. It's become a cultural shorthand for pleasure itself, but that's not quite right. Dopamine is more like anticipation, motivation, the neural equivalent of leaning forward. When something good happens, when you get that promotion or that first kiss or that perfectly ripe peach, dopamine neurons in. Your ventral tegmental area fire rapidly, sending signals to your nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. This creates what neuroscientists call a reward prediction error, the difference between what you expected and what you got. If reality exceeds expectation, dopamine surges. You feel good. Here's where it gets interesting. Those dopamine neurons aren't responding to the goodness of the experience itself. They're responding to the surprise, the unexpectedness, the gap between prediction and outcome. After the first few times, once your brain knows what to expect, the dopamine response diminishes. Not because the experience has become less objectively good, but because it's become predictable. Your brain has updated its model of the world. This is hedonic adaptation, and it operates on multiple timescales simultaneously. In the short term, receptor downregulation happens within hours to days. Your neurons literally reduce the number of dopamine receptors on their surfaces when the system is overstimulated. Think of it as turning down the volume. If dopamine were constantly flooding the system at high intensity, the signal would become meaningless, like trying to detect a whisper in a stadium full of screaming fans. Over weeks and months, habituation occurs at the level of neural circuits. The same stimulus triggers weaker responses in the same pathways. This isn't damage or dysfunction, it's efficiency. Your brain is conserving resources, redirecting attention to novel information that might matter for survival. In the environment where these systems evolved, obsessing over yesterday's successful hunt would have been maladaptive. Better to stay alert to new threats and opportunities. The effects show up in research with remarkable consistency. A study following lottery winners found that after an initial spike, their happiness levels returned to baseline within months. Another looking at newly married couples found the same pattern: intense elevation, followed by gradual return to pre-marriage levels of life satisfaction. The same holds for promotions, moves to better climates, and even some medical improvements. The baseline pulls you back. But what is this baseline? It's not a fixed point so much as a range, a set point around which your mood oscillates. The mechanisms maintaining it are multiple and redundant. Beyond dopamine, serotonin systems regulate mood stability. GABA and glutamate balance excitation and inhibition throughout the brain. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis manages your stress response, and chronic activation can shift your baseline downward by remodeling neural architecture. There's also opponent process theory, which suggests that any deviation from baseline triggers compensatory responses that pull you back. Feel too good, and your brain mobilizes mechanisms to bring you down. Feel too bad, and it eventually musters counterforces to bring you up. This is why the euphoria of certain drugs is followed by crashes, and why intense grief eventually softens. The system seeks equilibrium. This can sound deterministic, even depressing, but consider what it's accomplishing. Without hedonic adaptation, you'd be paralyzed by every good experience, unable to move forward because the feeling would never fade enough to free your attention. You'd also be crushed by every loss, every disappointment becoming permanent. The adaptation allows you to integrate experiences and keep functioning. It's a feature, not a bug, even when it frustrates you. The chemical specifics matter here. Dopamine isn't working alone. Endogenous opioids, your brain's own morphine-like compounds, are released during pleasurable experiences and contribute to the feeling of reward. These activate mu-opioid receptors in brain regions, including the nucleus accumbens, creating a sense of liking as distinct from wanting. But these systems adapt too. Chronic elevation of opioid signaling leads to tolerance, requiring higher levels to achieve the same effect. This is why addiction is so insidious, a hijacking of normal adaptation processes. Another player is oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, though that's oversimplified. Oxytocin does facilitate social connection and pair bonding, but it also appears to modulate the salience of social information and can intensify negative social experiences as much as positive ones. Its role in happiness is complex and context-dependent. What matters here is that even oxytocin systems show adaptation. The intensity of new love doesn't last in part because oxytocin responses normalize over time. Now consider the timeline. Some adaptations happen within minutes. The neurons responding to a repeated stimulus will fire less vigorously on the second presentation than the first, assuming nothing has changed. This is sensory adaptation, present in every modality from vision to touch to taste. That first sip of coffee is always the best of the morning. By the third cup, you barely notice. Other adaptations take weeks or months. Moving to a new city feels novel and energizing for a while, then becomes routine. The promotion that felt transformative becomes just your job. The mechanisms here involve not just receptor changes, but actual structural remodeling of neural circuits. Synapses strengthen or weaken. Dendritic spines grow or retract. Your brain is physically different after adaptation, optimized for the new normal. And some adaptations take years. People who become paralyzed in accidents report, after enough time has passed, returning to happiness levels not dramatically different from before the injury. This seems almost impossible, an insult to the magnitude of the loss, but it reflects the brain's extraordinary capacity to recalibrate. The baseline shifts, accommodates, finds equilibrium at a new set point. Not immediately, and not without struggle, but eventually. There are limits, of course. Some circumstances are so adverse, so unremitting in their negativity, that adaptation is incomplete or impossible. Chronic pain, severe depression, ongoing trauma. These can prevent the return to baseline or lower it substantially. The system has range, but not infinite plasticity. Context matters. Resources matter. What else is happening in your life matters. Still, the general principle holds. Positive experiences produce temporary elevations that fade. Your brain adapts. The happiness doesn't last because the system is designed to move on, to keep you responsive to new information, to prevent you from becoming so satisfied that you stop seeking, striving, adapting. In the ancestral environment, the humans who stayed happy with what they had were probably outcompeted by the ones who kept wanting more. Which brings us to a darker implication. If happiness doesn't last, if your brain is built to adapt away from it, then pursuing happiness directly might be something like chasing the horizon. The closer you get, the farther it recedes. Not because happiness is impossible, but because the mechanism that delivers it is the same mechanism that takes it away. This isn't just philosophy, it's chemistry, circuitry, the physical architecture of experience. Your dopamine neurons will recalibrate, your receptors will downregulate, your baseline will reassert itself. This happens whether you understand it or not, whether you like it or not. The happiness doesn't last because your brain won't let it. The brain doesn't experience your life directly. It experiences its own interpretation of your life, filtered through comparison processes that run constantly, mostly beneath conscious awareness. You think you're evaluating whether you're happy with your salary, your relationship, your body. What you're actually doing is comparing your current state to a shifting array of reference points, and those comparisons determine your subjective experience more than the objective facts ever could. This happens in the prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral regions involved in working memory and cognitive control. When you assess your circumstances, these areas activate along with the anterior cingulate cortex, which flags discrepancies between expected and actual states. The process isn't passive observation, it's active construction, your brain building a sense of satisfaction or dissatisfaction by running comparisons against multiple benchmarks simultaneously. The first and most obvious benchmark is your past self. You compare where you are now to where you were then. Got a raise? Your brain checks it against your previous salary. Started dating someone? The comparison runs against being single, but also against previous relationships. This seems straightforward until you realize the comparison isn't to objective past reality. It's to your memory of past reality, which is already distorted by previous comparisons and reconstructions. Research on memory shows we don't store experiences like video files. We store fragments, impressions, and each time we recall something, we rebuild it from those pieces, influenced by our current state and beliefs. This means your reference point is itself unstable. You might remember being less happy when single than you actually were, which makes your current relationship seem better by contrast. Or you might romanticize the past, which makes the present feel like a decline. Either way, you're comparing yourself to fiction. The second benchmark is other people. Social comparison is so fundamental to human cognition that it appears to be automatic, activated even when you consciously try to avoid it. Your brain looks at what others have, what they've achieved, where they are in life, and uses that information to calibrate your own position. This made sense evolutionarily. In a social species, your relative standing matters as much as your absolute resources. Being the weakest member of a strong group might offer better survival odds than being average in a weak one. But the mechanism doesn't know it's living in the modern world, where your comparison set includes not just your immediate community, but everyone on social media, in the news, in entertainment. The range has expanded beyond anything your brain evolved to handle. Suddenly, you're comparing your normal life to highlight reels curated by thousands of people, most of whom you'll never meet. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex doesn't adjust for this. It just processes the discrepancy and generates dissatisfaction. Studies consistently show that social comparison predicts unhappiness more than objective circumstances do. People with objectively good lives report lower satisfaction when surrounded by those with even better lives. People with objectively difficult lives report higher satisfaction when their reference group shares similar difficulties. Your brain cares about the gap, not the absolute position. This is why raises often fail to improve happiness if everyone else got raises too. The comparison neutralizes the gain. The third benchmark is counterfactual alternatives, the paths not taken, the versions of your life that could have happened but didn't. Your prefrontal cortex generates these constantly. What if you'd chosen the other job, the other city, the other relationship? This capacity for mental time travel and simulation is one of humanity's cognitive superpowers. It enables planning, learning from hypothetical scenarios, preparing for multiple futures. It also torments you with visions of better lives you might have lived. Counterfactual thinking activates medial prefrontal regions involved in self-referential processing. When you imagine alternate versions of yourself, your brain treats them almost like real competitors. The comparison feels as meaningful as comparing yourself to an actual person. This is why near misses feel worse than clear losses. Coming in second generates more regret than coming in seventh because it's easier to imagine the counterfactual where you came in first. Just one thing different and you'd have won. These three comparison types interact. You're simultaneously comparing your current self to your past self, to other people, and to imagined alternatives. The prefrontal cortex integrates this information into an overall evaluation, a sense of whether you're doing well or poorly. But the targets keep moving. Your past self changes as memory reconstructs it. Other people's circumstances change, or at least your knowledge of them does. And you generate new counterfactuals as new possibilities emerge. This creates a moving target problem for happiness. Even if your objective circumstances improve, your reference points adjust, and the comparison might yield the same dissatisfaction. You get the promotion, but now you're comparing yourself to people at the next level up, instead of your former peers. You're also comparing yourself to a counterfactual where you got an even better promotion or where you made the jump years earlier. The gap persists. There's a mathematical quality to this. Imagine satisfaction as the difference between outcomes and comparisons. If outcomes improve, but comparisons improve proportionally, satisfaction stays constant. This is exactly what happens in many domains. Income is the classic example. Within countries, relative income predicts happiness better than absolute income. A person making $50,000 surrounded by people making $40,000 reports higher satisfaction than someone making $70,000 surrounded by people making $100,000. The absolute improvement is erased by the comparison shift. The neural substrates here are revealing. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, involved in value computation and decision-making, doesn't encode absolute values. It encodes relative values, differences, and comparisons. When researchers scan brains during reward tasks, this region activates more strongly to rewards that exceed expectations than to objectively larger rewards that meet expectations. Your brain is literally built to care more about beating the reference point than about the magnitude of the outcome. This shows up in unexpected places. Studies of Olympic medalists found that bronze winners were happier than silver winners. The bronze medalists compared themselves to the counterfactual of no medal at all and felt grateful. The silver medalists compared themselves to the gold they nearly won and felt disappointed. Same objective achievement, different comparison, completely different emotional outcome. The prefrontal cortex constructed opposite experiences from similar facts. Another dimension is temporal comparison. You don't just compare your current self to your past self. You compare your current trajectory to your expected trajectory. Am I progressing as fast as I thought I would? Am I where I plan to be by this age? These comparisons involve the same neural machinery, but add temporal projection. You're comparing not just states, but rates of change, slopes rather than points. This is why stagnation feels worse than slow progress, even if the stagnant position is objectively good. The comparison is to expected momentum, and falling short generates distress. Culture shapes the comparison process substantially. Individualistic cultures emphasize personal achievement and upward mobility, making upward social comparisons more common and more painful. Collectivist cultures emphasize group harmony and role fulfillment, shifting comparisons toward relational adequacy rather than individual standing. Neither eliminates comparison, but they redirect it. Your prefrontal cortex runs the comparisons your culture trains it to run. There's also hedonic framing, the way you construct the comparison itself. The same situation can be framed as a gain or a loss, depending on the reference point. Getting 80% of what you want feels good if you expected 50%. It feels terrible if you expected 100%. The outcome is identical. The comparison differs. Research on framing effects shows that humans are loss-averse, feeling losses more intensely than equivalent gains. This means negative comparisons, where you fall short of the reference point, hurt more than positive comparisons feel good. The asymmetry biases you toward dissatisfaction. What makes this particularly tricky is that you can't easily opt out. The comparison processes are largely automatic, activated before conscious awareness. You can notice them, question them, try to adjust your reference points deliberately, but you can't simply turn them off. Your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is going to keep doing what it does. The comparisons will keep running. Some people do seem better at managing this. They set realistic reference points, limit social comparison, practice gratitude to anchor attention on what they have rather than what they lack. These aren't eliminations of the comparison process. They're strategic interventions in it, attempts to choose reference points that produce more favorable evaluations. The mechanism remains. The targets shift. The implication is deeply inconvenient. If happiness depends more on comparisons than on circumstances, then improving circumstances won't reliably improve happiness unless you also manage the comparisons. And managing the comparisons requires recognizing that your brain is running them constantly, automatically, constructing your experience through processes you don't directly control. The facts of your life matter less than the frame. The frame is always relative, and relative to what keeps changing. You're standing in the future, looking back at now. Your brain does this constantly, simulating tomorrow, next year, a decade ahead, trying to predict how you'll feel when certain things happen. This ability to mentally time travel, to project yourself into hypothetical futures and imagine the emotional consequences, is uniquely human and profoundly useful. It's also systematically wrong in ways that shape every major decision you make. The research here is extensive and uncomfortable. People consistently overestimate how much emotion future events will generate and how long those emotions will last. You think getting the job will make you happy for months. It makes you happy for weeks. You think the breakup will devastate you indefinitely. You're mostly recovered in less time than you'd predict. The technical terms are impact bias for overestimating intensity and duration neglect, for underestimating how quickly you'll adapt. Together, they create a systematic error in your mental model of your own future. Daniel Gilbert and Timothy Wilson mapped this territory thoroughly, starting in the late 90s. Their studies showed people predictions about future emotional states across dozens of scenarios. Tenure decisions for professors, election outcomes for voters, romantic breakups for students, football games for fans. In every case, people predicted stronger and longer-lasting reactions than they actually experienced. The gap wasn't small. People weren't slightly off. They were dramatically, consistently wrong about their own emotional futures. The mechanism involves several cognitive processes working in unfortunate combination. The first is focalism, the tendency to focus too narrowly on the event you're predicting and ignore everything else that will be happening in your life at that time. When you imagine getting promoted, your attention zeroes in on the promotion itself. You don't think about the other meetings you'll have that day, the traffic on the way home, argument with your partner that evening, the chronic back pain that won't care about your new title. But those things will all be present, diluting the emotional impact of the promotion. Your brain simulates futures with tunnel vision, spotlight on the main event, everything else fading to black. Real life doesn't work that way. Real life is cluttered, simultaneous, a dozen concerns competing for attention at once. The promotion happens in the context of everything else, and everything else dampens its emotional weight. This is why winning the lottery doesn't make people as happy as they expect. The money solves some problems, but daily life continues to generate new ones, and your attention can't stay fixed on the win indefinitely. The second mechanism is immune neglect, the tendency to underestimate your psychological immune system. This is Gilbert's term for all the processes your mind uses to cope with negative events: rationalization, reframing, downward comparison, meaning-making, distraction. These processes kick in automatically after bad events, softening the blow, helping you adapt. But when you're predicting how you'll feel, you don't account for them. You imagine the negative event hitting you with full force and staying at full force. You forget that you're resilient, that you'll find ways to make sense of it and move on. Studies on breakups illustrate this clearly. People predict they'll be miserable for months. They're miserable for weeks, sometimes days. The psychological immune system gets to work. They remember the relationship's flaws. They focus on new opportunities. They reconnect with friends. They construct narratives where the breakup was actually good. None of this feels like active coping in the moment. It feels like seeing things clearly. But it's immune response, your mind protecting itself from prolonged distress. Interestingly, the immune system works less well on positive events. There's no equivalent process to sustain happiness, the way there are processes to reduce unhappiness. So the asymmetry goes both ways. You underpredict your resilience to bad events and overpredict your enjoyment of good ones. The result is that you're wrong about emotional futures in both directions, but the errors conspire to make you overvalue things that don't matter as much as you think and underprepare for your own capacity to adapt. Another element is the distinction between experiencing self and remembering self, terms from Daniel Kahneman's research. The experiencing self lives through events moment by moment. The remembering self constructs narratives afterward. When you predict future emotions, you're imagining what the remembering self will report, not what the experiencing self will actually feel. But the remembering self uses shortcuts, particularly the peak-end rule. It weights the most intense moment and the final moment heavily and largely ignores duration. This creates prediction errors around duration. You think a week-long vacation will make you happier than a weekend trip. But the remembering self might compress both into similar narratives if the peaks and endings are comparable. You overestimate how much duration matters because the experiencing self cares about duration, but the remembering self doesn't. And you're confusing the two when you make predictions. There's also construal level theory, which holds that psychologically distant events are represented abstractly, while near events are represented concretely. When you imagine a job promotion far in the future, you think about it in terms of high-level features: success, respect, achievement. As it gets closer, you start thinking about specifics: the longer commute, the new responsibilities, the difficult colleague you'll now supervise. The abstract version sounds better than the concrete version. This is why anticipated events often disappoint. You predicted based on the abstract construal, but you experienced the concrete reality. The errors compound when you're making decisions. If you overestimate how happy something will make you, you might sacrifice too much to get it. People work extra hours for promotions that deliver less satisfaction than expected. They move to new cities for opportunities that feel routine within months. They pursue relationships they've idealized, then wonder why the reality feels flat. The misprediction leads to misallocation of effort and attention. On the negative side, mispredicting distress can make you risk-averse in counterproductive ways. You avoid career changes because you think failure would devastate you, but you'd actually adapt within weeks. You stay in bad relationships because you think being alone would be unbearable, but people report returning to baseline happiness faster than they predict. The exaggerated fear of negative outcomes keeps you stuck in suboptimal situations. Some of this is culturally reinforced. Stories and media portray emotional reactions as intense and prolonged. The movie shows the character devastated by rejection for the entire second act, not mostly over it by Tuesday. The song describes eternal love, not affection that fades to comfortable companionship. These narratives calibrate your expectations, teaching you to predict emotions that match dramatic arcs rather than psychological reality. Your brain also lacks good feedback mechanisms for correcting these errors. After you've mispredicted, you rarely go back and compare prediction to outcome systematically. You just move on to the next prediction. And when you do notice the gap, you tend to attribute it to special circumstances rather than to systematic bias. The promotion didn't make you as happy as expected? Must have been the specific job. You don't generalize to all promotions, all achievements. The learning doesn't stick. There are individual differences. Some people show larger impact bias than others. Neuroticism correlates with overestimating negative emotions. Extroversion correlates with overestimating positive emotions. But the general pattern holds across personalities. Humans as a category are bad at affective forecasting. The implications are fairly grim if you think about them. You're navigating major life decisions with a broken compass. You're predicting emotional outcomes that won't occur, then organizing your life around those predictions. The job, the relationship, the house, the achievement you think will make you happy won't deliver what you expect. And you won't fully learn from the misprediction because you won't track it carefully enough, and your brain will generate new, equally wrong predictions for the next thing. What makes this particularly frustrating is that you can know about impact bias intellectually and still experience it. Knowing that you overestimate doesn't automatically correct the overestimation. Prediction feels right in the moment. Your imagined future feels vivid and real. The emotional forecast feels like information rather than construction. So you believe it, act on it, and set yourself up for disappointment or unnecessary fear. Some researchers suggest strategies. Consider how you felt during similar past events. Ask people who've experienced what you're predicting how they actually felt. Focus on the mundane details that will surround the event rather than the event itself. These help somewhat, but they're swimming against powerful currents. Your brain wants to simulate futures with dramatic emotional weight. Reality insists on being more moderate. The distance between predicted emotion and experienced emotion is one more way happiness doesn't last. Not only do you adapt to positive circumstances, you also overestimated how good they'd feel in the first place. The gap between expectation and reality drains satisfaction twice. Once, when the thing itself matters less than you thought. Again, when you realize you sacrificed other things to get it. The misprediction and the adaptation work together, ensuring that the future you're building toward won't feel the way you imagine it will. Your happiness level right now, today, is not primarily the result of what happened to you this week or this year. It's not even primarily the result of what's happened to you in your entire life. A substantial portion of your baseline well-being was determined before you were born, written into the particular combination of genes you inherited. This is uncomfortable information, and the research behind it is both robust and widely misunderstood. The foundational work comes from twin studies, particularly those comparing identical twins raised apart. Identical twins share essentially all their DNA. If they're raised in different environments, separated at birth or early childhood, then similarities between them can be attributed primarily to genetics rather than shared experience. When researchers tracked these twins into adulthood and measured their subjective well-being, they found correlations that were disturbingly high. Studies from the Minnesota Twin Registry and similar projects found that identical twins raised apart showed happiness correlations around 0.4 to 0.5. That means that 40 to 50% of the variance in reported well-being could be attributed to heritable factors. Fraternal twins, who share only half their DNA on average, showed correlations around 0.2 to 0.3. Adopted siblings raised together, sharing environment but not genes, showed correlations near zero. The pattern points clearly toward genetic influence. This doesn't mean there's a single happiness gene. There isn't. What exists instead is a polygenic contribution, hundreds or thousands of genetic variants, each contributing tiny amounts to neurotransmitter function, receptor density, stress response, emotional reactivity, and baseline arousal. These biological substrates shape temperament, and temperament shapes how you experience everything that happens to you. Some of this runs through the serotonin system. Variations in the serotonin transporter gene, particularly the promoter region called 5-HTTLPR, have been associated with depression risk and stress sensitivity. People with the short allele variant show greater amygdala reactivity to negative stimuli and higher rates of depression after stressful life events. This doesn't doom them to unhappiness, but it adjusts the baseline, makes the system more vulnerable to perturbation. Dopamine genetics matter too. Variations in genes coding for dopamine receptors, transporters, and metabolizing enzymes affect reward sensitivity, motivation, and how much pleasure you extract from positive experiences. Someone with genetic variants that produce lower dopamine receptor density might need more intense or frequent rewards to feel the same satisfaction as someone whose receptors are more abundant or sensitive. The hedonic treadmill runs at different speeds for different people, partly because their reward systems are built differently. Then there's the stress response system. Genes affecting cortisol production, receptor function, and HPA axis regulation influence how strongly you react to stressors and how quickly you recover. Some people return to baseline within hours. Others stay elevated for days. This variance is partly learned, shaped by early experience and current circumstances, but it's also partly genetic. Your stress thermostat has a factory setting. The Big Five personality traits, which predict subjective well-being consistently, are themselves highly heritable. Neuroticism, the tendency toward negative emotion and stress reactivity, shows heritability around 0.4 to 0.5. Extroversion, associated with positive emotion and reward sensitivity, is similarly heritable. If you inherit a temperament high in neuroticism and low in extroversion, your genetic starting point for happiness is measurably lower than someone with the reverse pattern. This is where the set point theory enters. The idea is that each person has a genetically influenced baseline level of happiness around which they fluctuate. Good events push you above the set point temporarily. Bad events push you below. But the set point exerts a gravitational pull, drawing you back over time. This is hedonic adaptation again, but now understood as partly genetically mediated. Your genes don't just influence how happy you are, they influence where you return to after life pushes you around. The most famous formulation comes from work by David Lycan and Auke Tellegen, who analyzed twin data and concluded that trying to be happier might be as futile as trying to be taller. The quote is deliberately provocative, and it overstates the case, but it captures the unsettling implication. If half your happiness is genetic and genes don't change, then there's a ceiling to how much you can improve your well-being through effort or circumstance. Later research complicated this picture. The percentage attributable to genetics varies depending on how you measure happiness and which populations you study. Some studies find lower heritability, around 0.30 to 0.40. And heritability doesn't mean immutability. It means that in the environment studied, genetic differences accounted for that much variance. Change the environments dramatically, and the heritability estimate could shift. There's also gene-environment interaction, where genetic effects depend on environmental context. The serotonin transporter example works this way. The short allele increases depression risk, but primarily in people who experience significant life stress. In stable, supportive environments, the effect is minimal. So the genetic influence isn't deterministic. It's probabilistic, modulating how environmental factors affect you. Still, the basic finding persists across studies and populations. A large chunk of happiness variance is heritable. This shows up in longitudinal research too. When you track people over decades, their happiness levels show remarkable stability despite major life changes. People who were relatively happy at 20 tend to be relatively happy at 60, even if they've experienced marriage, divorce, career success, health problems, and everything else life delivers. The ranking stays fairly consistent. The set point asserts itself. What's genetically influenced isn't the conscious experience of happiness exactly. It's the underlying biological systems that generate that experience. Your baseline cortical arousal, your amygdala's reactivity threshold, your ventral striatum's response to reward, the efficiency of your prefrontal cortex in regulating emotion. These are physical properties of your nervous system, shaped during development by genetic instructions interacting with environment. Once established, they're relatively stable. This creates a cruel lottery. Some people are born with nervous systems predisposed to extract more pleasure from experiences, to recover faster from setbacks, to maintain optimism without much effort. Others are born with systems that trend toward anxiety, rumination, emotional volatility. The first group isn't happier because they're better people or making better choices. They're happier because their neurons are wired differently. The life circumstances you'd expect to matter, income above poverty level, marital status, education, even health to some degree, account for surprisingly little variance in well-being once you control for genetics and personality. Estimates suggest maybe 10 to 15%. That's not nothing, but it's less than most people assume. Meanwhile, genetics is sitting at 40 to 50%. The starting conditions matter more than most of the things that happen to you. There are limits to this determinism. The genetic component explains variance within populations, not absolute levels. It doesn't tell you whether humans in general could be happier if circumstances changed dramatically. And the heritability of well-being doesn't mean specific interventions can't work. Even if your set point is genetically influenced, you might still be able to spend more time above it through behavior, therapy, medication, or environmental design. But the set point remains. After interventions, after achievements, after losses, the pull back toward baseline continues. Some people's baseline is higher. They won the genetic lottery. They'll generally be happier across their lifespan, regardless of what they do or what happens to them. Others drew a lower baseline. They'll have to work harder for the same level of well-being, and they'll likely never reach the effortless contentment some people seem to inhabit naturally. This isn't a moral judgment, it's biology. Your serotonin transporter variants aren't earned or deserved. Your dopamine receptor density isn't a reward for virtue. These are accidents of inheritance, combinations of alleles that happen to come together when a particular sperm met a particular egg. The resulting temperament shapes everything you feel, but you didn't choose it, and you can't fully change it. The implication is that happiness, at least in part, isn't something you achieve. It's something you're born with or without. You can optimize around the margins, make choices that keep you closer to your personal ceiling, avoid circumstances that drop you far below your floor. But the range itself, the span between your worst and best possible states, is substantially constrained by genetics. The ceiling is real, the floor is real, and both were set before you had any say in the word matter. Getting more doesn't make you happier if wanting more rises just as fast. This is the hedonic treadmill in its purest form, and it operates with mathematical precision. You achieve something, acquire something, reach some new level, and instead of satisfaction, you experience a brief elevation followed by the emergence of new desires calibrated to your new position. The gap between what you have and what you want remains constant, which means your happiness remains constant despite objective improvement. The mechanism starts with adaptation, which we've already covered, but extends into aspiration adjustment. As your circumstances improve, your aspirations don't stay fixed. They rise to match or exceed your new reality. This happens partly through social comparison, the constant measuring of yourself against others. When you get promoted, your reference group shifts. You're no longer comparing yourself to your former peers at the lower level. You're comparing yourself to people at your new level, and they become the new standard. Some of them are doing better than you. The comparison gap reappears at a higher altitude. Research on income illustrates this relentlessly. Within a country at a given time, wealthier people report higher life satisfaction than poorer people. The correlation is real and replicable. But over time, as entire societies become wealthier, average happiness doesn't increase proportionally. In the United States, real per capita income roughly tripled between 1950 and 2000, but average reported happiness stayed essentially flat. People got richer, their stuff got better, their aspirations rose in tandem. The gap persisted. This is the Easterlin paradox, named after economist Richard Easterlin, who documented it in the 70s. At any snapshot in time, relative income predicts happiness. Across time, absolute income increases don't. The explanation is that income is positional. What matters isn't how much you make in absolute terms, but where you stand in the distribution. As everyone gets richer together, nobody's relative position improves, so nobody gets happier. Your brain isn't equipped to feel grateful for $50,000 a year. It's equipped to assess whether $50,000 is good relative to what others make, what you made before, what you expected to make, what you think you deserve. If $50,000 puts you ahead, you feel good. If it puts you behind, you feel bad. The number itself is almost irrelevant. It's the comparison that generates the emotion. This extends beyond income to nearly every domain where achievement is possible. You train for a marathon and complete it. The accomplishment feels significant for a while, then fades. Now the question becomes, can you run it faster? Can you qualify for Boston? Can you complete an ultramarathon? The goalpost moves. The previous achievement becomes baseline, unremarkable, just what you do now. Satisfaction requires the next level. Or relationships. You spend years wanting a partner. You find someone. The relief and happiness are genuine but temporary. Soon, you're evaluating the relationship against new standards. Are we compatible enough? Are we progressing toward marriage? Is this the best partner I could have? The aspiration adjusts from wanting a relationship to wanting a better relationship, or the next milestone, or certainty that you've optimized the choice. The gap reopens. The treadmill operates through multiple psychological mechanisms simultaneously. One is the already mentioned social comparison. Another is self-imposed standard escalation. As you achieve things, you internalize higher standards for what counts as success. A competent performance used to satisfy you. Now, only an exceptional one does. Your internal benchmark rises with your capability. This makes sense from a skill development perspective. Drives improvement, but it prevents satisfaction from accumulating. There's also counterfactual comparison, where the standard isn't other people or your past self, but imagined better versions of your current situation. You got the job, but you imagine the higher paying offer you could have negotiated. You bought the house, but you imagine the one with the better location you saw last week. These counterfactuals create new reference points against which your actual circumstances feel inadequate. The treadmill includes imaginary futures and alternate presents, not just real comparisons. Consumer culture accelerates this process deliberately. Marketing exists to generate aspiration, to make you feel that what you have is insufficient and what you could have would improve your life. Every advertisement is an intervention in your aspiration level, an attempt to raise the bar so your current state feels like deprivation. This isn't conspiracy, it's business model. Companies profit when you want things, so they invest heavily in making you want things. Your hedonic treadmill has a corporate sponsor. The adaptation happens fastest for material goods. New car, new phone, new clothes. These deliver brief satisfaction spikes that decay within weeks or months. The item becomes part of the background, your new normal, and attention shifts to what you don't have yet. This is why people who focus heavily on material acquisition tend to show lower life satisfaction over time. They're running hardest on the exact treadmill dimension that adapts fastest. Interestingly, experiences show slower adaptation than possessions, though they still adapt. A vacation provides memories that can be savored afterward, extending the happiness beyond the event itself. But even experiences become reference points. Once you've been to 10 countries, the 11th is less novel. Once you've eaten at high-end restaurants regularly, they become expected rather than special. The aspiration escalates here too, just more slowly. Status is particularly vicious because it's purely relative. There's no absolute amount of status. It only exists in comparison to others. So status seeking guarantees treadmill dynamics. Any status you gain either puts you in competition with higher status people, generating new dissatisfaction, or you adapt to your current level and it stops feeling significant. You can't win at status, you can only keep running. The neuroscience here involves the same reward prediction error mechanism from dopamine systems. Your brain predicts how good something will feel based on your current aspiration level. When you get it, if it meets or slightly exceeds prediction, there's a brief positive signal. Then the system recalibrates. The new level becomes the new prediction. Future rewards need to exceed this higher prediction to generate positive feelings. The baseline for good enough has risen. This recalibration is adaptive, in a context where resources are scarce and effort matters. If you became permanently satisfied after one successful hunt, you'd stop hunting and starve. The system that keeps you motivated despite success was useful in ancestral environments. In modern environments of abundance, the same system creates chronic dissatisfaction. You have enough, but the system doesn't recognize enough. It only recognizes more than before, versus less than before. And more than before stops registering once you adapt. Some people seem to run faster on the treadmill than others. This correlates with personality traits, particularly neuroticism and conscientiousness. High neuroticism means faster adaptation of positive feelings and stronger persistence of negative ones. High conscientiousness means setting higher standards and updating them frequently. Together, these traits can create a particularly punishing treadmill where achievements never satisfy for long and new goals appear immediately. There's also cultural variation. Cultures emphasizing perpetual self-improvement and achievement tend to produce faster aspiration escalation. Cultures emphasizing acceptance and contentment with one's role slow the treadmill somewhat. Neither eliminates it, but they change the speed and the domains where it operates most intensely. An American professional and a Buddhist monk are both on treadmills, but the treadmills are calibrated differently. The cruelest aspect is that you can understand the treadmill intellectually and still run on it. Knowing that the promotion won't make you lastingly happier doesn't stop you from wanting it and pursuing it. Knowing that the new house will become unremarkable within months doesn't prevent the aspiration from forming. The mechanism operates largely outside conscious control. Your prefrontal cortex can observe it, comment on it, even predict it accurately. It can't stop it. Attempts to step off the treadmill usually involve trying to prevent aspiration escalation. Gratitude practices to maintain appreciation for what you have. Voluntary simplicity to reduce exposure to new desires. Mindfulness to notice satisfaction in present circumstances rather than always looking ahead. These can help somewhat, slowing the treadmill or reducing the energy you invest in running. But the underlying mechanism persists. Your brain will keep comparing, keep generating new wants, keep adjusting the standard for what counts as good. The hedonic treadmill means that achievement as a happiness strategy is fundamentally flawed. Not because achievements don't matter or don't feel good, but because the feeling doesn't accumulate. Each success delivers diminishing returns as your aspiration level rises to meet it. You're solving an equation where both sides increase together. The balance never shifts in your favor. You get more, you want more. The gap between having and wanting remains constant, and happiness, which lives in that gap, stays exactly where it was. How you remember an experience determines whether you'll seek it again, avoid it, or feel satisfied having had it. But memory doesn't work the way you think it does. You don't store experiences as they unfold, second by second, giving equal weight to each moment. Instead, your brain uses shortcuts that distort the relationship between what you lived through and what you remember living through. These distortions reshape your pursuit of happiness in predictable, often counterproductive ways. The core finding comes from research on what's called the peak end rule. When you remember an experience, your brain gives disproportionate weight to two specific moments: the most intense point, whether positive or negative, and the final moments. Everything else, the duration, the average quality, the mundane stretches, these contribute surprisingly little to your overall memory of the experience. This was demonstrated most famously in a study involving colonoscopies, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds, but remarkably revealing. Patients undergoing colonoscopy procedures were asked to report their pain level in real time, moment by moment, throughout the procedure. Afterward, they rated the overall pain of the experience from memory. The duration of the procedure varied substantially between patients. Logic suggests that longer procedures with more total pain should be remembered as worse. That's not what happened. What predicted the memory rating was the peak pain level and the pain level in the final moments. Duration barely mattered. In a follow-up, researchers deliberately extended some procedures, keeping the scope inserted but stationary, not causing additional diagnostic benefit, but also not causing the intense pain of active examination. This added moderately uncomfortable minutes to the total experience. Patients who received this extension, which increased their total pain, actually remembered the procedure as less painful overall, because it ended on a less intense note. More total suffering led to better memories because the ending improved. This finding has been replicated across numerous contexts. Vacations are remembered based on peak moments and how they end, not how long they last. A week-long trip with a terrible final day is remembered less fondly than a 4-day trip with a pleasant ending, even if the week-long trip had more total enjoyable moments. Your brain compresses the experience, extracts the peak and the end, discards most of the rest, and constructs a summary judgment from that limited sample. The mechanism involves how memories are encoded and retrieved. During an experience, your hippocampus and associated structures are constantly processing sensory and emotional information. But not all of it gets consolidated into long-term memory. Emotional intensity acts as a tagging mechanism. High arousal moments, positive or negative, get priority for consolidation. They're what your brain decides is important to remember. The final moments also get tagged, possibly because endings signal completion and help your brain categorize the experience as a coherent episode. Moderate moments, the bulk of experience, don't activate the consolidation machinery as strongly. They're processed in working memory, experienced in real time, then largely lost. This is efficient from a storage perspective. Your brain can't keep everything. It needs to compress. The peak-end rule is the compression algorithm, keeping what seems most informative and discarding the rest. The problem is that this creates a systematic mismatch between experiencing and remembering. Your experiencing self, the version of you living through events moment to moment, cares about duration and average quality. If something is mildly unpleasant for an hour, that's worse while it's happening than something mildly unpleasant for 30 minutes. But your remembering self, which constructs the narrative afterward and determines whether you pursue similar experiences in the future, doesn't care much about duration. It cares about peaks and endings. So you make future decisions based on memories that don't accurately reflect what you actually experienced. This shows up in vacation planning. People choose longer vacations, assuming more time equals more happiness. But studies show that vacation length correlates weakly with remembered satisfaction. What matters more is whether there were peak moments, memorable highlights, and whether the ending was pleasant or marred by travel delays and stress. A 4-day trip with one spectacular day and a smooth return home might be remembered more fondly than a 2-week trip that was consistently fine but ended badly. The same logic applies to career projects, relationships, even meals. A dinner with a disappointing dessert is remembered less positively than a shorter dinner that ended on a high note. A relationship that deteriorates at the end colors the entire memory, even if there were years of genuine happiness. Your remembering self is constructing a story, and stories are built around peaks and resolutions, not average moments. There's also duration neglect, the tendency to ignore length almost entirely when forming summary evaluations. In one study, participants listened to annoying sounds. One group heard 60 seconds of noise. Another heard 60 seconds of the same noise, plus an additional 30 seconds of slightly less annoying noise. The second group experienced more total annoyance, but rated the experience as less unpleasant because the ending was better. 90 seconds remembered as better than 60 seconds of objectively identical initial experience, simply because of what came after. Your brain isn't broken. This is a feature, not a bug, from an evolutionary perspective. Remembering every detail of every experience would be computationally expensive and probably useless. What matters for survival is learning whether to approach or avoid similar situations in the future. The peak tells you how intense things can get. The end tells you how it resolved. These are useful data points for future decision-making. Duration is less informative. Whether the threat lasted 1 minute or 5, the relevant fact is that it was threatening and how it turned out. But in modern contexts, this creates problems. You chase experiences that produce good memories rather than experiences that feel good while you're having them. You might endure a stressful, exhausting trip because you know the photos and stories will create peak moments you'll remember fondly, even though the actual experience, hour by hour, is mostly fatigue and hassle. You're optimizing for your remembering self at the expense of your experiencing self. This also explains why people are willing to extend unpleasant experiences if it improves the ending. We accept additional discomfort during difficult conversations to reach resolution, making the total experience longer and more painful, because we know the memory will be better if it ends well. We stay at parties longer than we're enjoying them if leaving early would create an awkward ending. We're managing the memory, not the experience. The peak end rule also distorts how you evaluate ongoing life satisfaction. When researchers ask people how happy they are, the answers are influenced heavily by recent peak moments and current circumstances, not by the sum total of experienced moments over weeks or months. Someone who had an exceptional weekend and is currently comfortable will report higher life satisfaction than someone whose weeks were consistently fine but unremarkable, and who is currently mildly uncomfortable. The peaks and the present moment dominate the evaluation. There's an asymmetry worth noting. Negative peaks seem to have stronger effects than positive peaks, likely because your brain prioritizes threat detection. A single terrible moment can poison the memory of an otherwise good experience more easily than a single wonderful moment can redeem an otherwise bad experience. The ending can mitigate this somewhat, but the negativity bias is real. Your remembering self weights bad more heavily than good. This has implications for how you pursue happiness. If happiness is understood as positive memories, then the peak end rule suggests you should prioritize creating memorable high points and ensuring experiences end well, even at the cost of shorter duration or lower average quality. But if happiness is understood as positive experience while it's happening, then duration matters more, and you should optimize differently. The two selves, experiencing and remembering, want different things. Most people don't consciously choose between these. They muddle along, sometimes optimizing for memories, sometimes for present experience, often confused about why things that should make them happy don't. The confusion stems from not recognizing that memory is reconstruction, not recording, and the reconstruction follows rules that don't align with the actual texture of lived experience. You can know this and still fall into the same traps. You can understand the peak end rule intellectually and still choose the longer vacation, still stay at the party too long, still judge your life based on recent peaks rather than sustained quality. The remembering self is the one making plans and evaluations, and it's working from distorted data. The experiencing self has the accurate information, but doesn't get to write the story. The mismatch is built into the architecture of consciousness, and recognizing it doesn't give you the power to resolve it. There's a different kind of well-being that doesn't depend on feeling good. This runs counter to common sense, which treats happiness as synonymous with pleasure. But the research distinguishes sharply between hedonic well-being, based on pleasure and pain, and eudaimonic well-being, based on meaning, growth, and functioning well as a human being. The difference isn't semantic. These are separate psychological constructs with different predictors, different neural correlates, and crucially, different temporal dynamics. Hedonic well-being is what we've been discussing, the balance of positive and negative affect, life satisfaction, subjective pleasure. It's what most people mean when they say happiness. It adapts quickly, responds to circumstances, fluctuates day to day based on events and comparisons. The hedonic treadmill applies here with full force. Positive experiences fade, aspirations adjust, you return to baseline. This is happiness that doesn't last. Eudaimonic well-being comes from Aristotelian philosophy, but has been operationalized in modern psychology through constructs like purpose, autonomy, personal growth, self-acceptance, mastery, and positive relationships. Carol Riff developed a widely used framework identifying 6 dimensions: having purpose and meaning in life, continued growth and development, autonomy and self-determination, environmental mastery, self-acceptance, and quality connections with others. These aren't about feeling good. They're about functioning well and living in accordance with your values and potential. The distinction shows up in factor analysis. When you measure multiple aspects of well-being and look at how they cluster statistically, hedonic and eudaimonic items form separate factors. People can score high on one and low on the other. You can feel good without meaning. You can have meaning without feeling good. They're correlated. People with more meaning tend to report more happiness, but they're separable and they operate differently. One key difference is adaptation. Hedonic well-being adapts rapidly. Eudaimonic well-being shows more stability and less susceptibility to hedonic adaptation mechanisms. If your well-being comes from having purpose, from working toward meaningful goals, from feeling that you're growing and developing, those sources don't fade the way pleasure does. Purpose doesn't habituate. Growth doesn't produce tolerance. The satisfaction derived from eudaimonic sources appears more sustainable. This has been demonstrated in longitudinal studies. When researchers track people over years or decades, measures of eudaimonic well-being predict later life satisfaction, health, and even mortality better than measures of hedonic well-being alone. People who report high purpose and growth show better outcomes down the line compared to people who just report feeling good. The mechanisms likely involve behavioral differences. People pursuing meaning engage in healthier behaviors, maintain stronger relationships, cope better with stress, all of which compound over time. There's also a neurobiological distinction, though the research here is still developing. Hedonic pleasure activates reward circuitry, ventral striatum, nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area, the dopamine pathways we've discussed. Eudaimonic well-being appears to involve different networks, particularly the prefrontal cortex regions associated with self-regulation, goal-directed behavior, and integration of values into action. The 2 types of well-being don't just feel different subjectively. They're processed differently in the brain. Gene expression studies have found surprising differences. People high in hedonic well-being show one pattern of inflammatory and antiviral gene expression. People high in eudaimonic well-being show a different pattern, with lower inflammatory markers and better immune function. This is correlational, and the causal direction isn't established, but it suggests the distinction has biological significance beyond subjective report. The sources differ too. Hedonic well-being comes from pleasure, comfort, satisfaction of desires, positive experiences, absence of pain. Eudaimonic well-being comes from challenge, effort, growth, contribution, connection, living according to values even when it's difficult. These can overlap. Meaningful work can be pleasurable, but they can also conflict. You might choose a difficult path because it's meaningful even though it's not pleasurable. That's eudaimonic well-being at the expense of hedonic well-being. Parenting is a clear example. Studies consistently show that parents report lower hedonic well-being than non-parents. Less happiness, more stress, more negative affect, less sleep, less freedom, more daily frustration. But parents also report higher eudaimonic well-being, more meaning, purpose, connection, sense that life matters. The moment-to-moment experience is often less pleasant. The overall sense of living a meaningful life is stronger. The two dimensions diverge sharply. Religious and spiritual practices show similar patterns. Regular meditation, prayer, and religious involvement correlate with eudaimonic well-being, with meaning and purpose, but don't always correlate with hedonic happiness, especially practices that involve discipline, sacrifice, or confronting difficult truths. People pursue these practices not because they feel good, but because they feel meaningful. And that meaning sustains engagement in ways that pleasure doesn't. The temporal aspect is critical. Hedonic pleasure is immediate. You eat the food, you feel the pleasure now. Eudaimonic satisfaction often requires delayed gratification. You work toward a goal for months or years. The meaning sustains you during the process, but the sense of accomplishment comes later. This makes eudaimonic pursuits harder to choose in the moment because the payoff is distant and uncertain. Hedonic options deliver immediately. This relates to construal level theory again. Abstract, high-level thinking favors eudaimonic choices, growth, contribution, values. Concrete, immediate thinking favors hedonic choices, comfort, pleasure, ease. When you're planning your life from a distance, you choose meaning. When you're deciding what to do right now, you choose pleasure. The gap between what you value abstractly and what you choose concretely is partly a gap between eudaimonic and hedonic motivation. There's evidence that eudaimonic well-being becomes more important with age. Younger people prioritize hedonic goals, fun, excitement, new experiences. Older people prioritize eudaimonic goals, meaning, connection, contribution. This might reflect changing time horizons. When the future seems long, you can afford to chase pleasure. When the future seems limited, meaning becomes more urgent. Or it might reflect developmental maturation, a shift from pleasure-seeking to meaning-making as people age. Culture shapes the balance too. Individualistic. Western cultures emphasize personal happiness and hedonic well-being. Collectivist cultures emphasize duty, contribution, and eudaimonic aspects like fulfilling your role. Neither is purely one or the other, but the emphasis differs, and this affects what people pursue and how they evaluate their lives. The practical implication is that if you're pursuing happiness exclusively through hedonic means, through pleasure and positive experiences, you're playing a game you can't win. The hedonic treadmill guarantees that approach won't produce lasting satisfaction. Pleasure adapts. Desires escalate. The baseline reasserts itself. But if you pursue eudaimonic well-being, meaning and growth and connection, those sources appear more stable and sustainable. This doesn't mean pleasure doesn't matter. Hedonic well-being contributes to quality of life and can't be dismissed. Chronic pain, poverty, oppression, these cause real hedonic suffering that matters morally and practically. The point isn't to abandon pleasure, but to recognize its limitations as a foundation for lasting well-being. Pleasure is necessary, but not sufficient. The challenge is that eudaimonic pursuits are often harder. They require effort, discipline, delayed gratification, sometimes discomfort. Pursuing meaning might mean choosing difficult work, challenging relationships, confronting painful truths, sacrificing comfort. These are choices your hedonic impulses resist. Your dopamine system wants the immediate reward, not the abstract future meaning. So even understanding that eudaimonic well-being is more sustainable doesn't make it easier to choose. There's also the question of authenticity. Eudaimonic well-being requires living in accordance with your actual values, not values imposed externally or adopted superficially. If you pursue what you think should be meaningful but doesn't actually resonate with you, the eudaimonic benefits don't materialize. The meaning has to be real, personally significant, genuinely chosen. This makes it harder than hedonic pursuits, which don't require that level of self-knowledge or authenticity. Still, the research suggests that what lasts, what provides well-being resistant to adaptation and circumstance, isn't pleasure. It's purpose. Not feeling good, but living well. Not satisfaction of desires, but fulfillment of potential. Not happiness that comes from getting what you want, but satisfaction that comes from becoming who you are and contributing something that matters. This is a different kind of happiness, one that doesn't depend on circumstances staying good or desires being met. It depends on engaging with life in ways that align with meaning. And meaning, unlike pleasure, doesn't seem to fade. There are moments when the self disappears and what remains is pure engagement, action without reflection, attention absorbed completely in what you're doing. This is flow, and it represents a paradox at the heart of happiness. The times people report being most satisfied, most fully alive, aren't times when they're consciously pursuing pleasure or thinking about how happy they are. They're times when they've forgotten about happiness entirely, forgotten about themselves, lost in activity that demands everything they have. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi studied this phenomenon for decades, starting in the 1970s, interviewing surgeons, rock climbers, chess players, dancers, musicians, anyone who described experiences of total absorption. The accounts were remarkably consistent across activities and cultures. People described losing track of time, forgetting their problems, feeling their actions flow effortlessly from intention, experiencing complete focus. They weren't thinking about whether they were happy. They were too busy doing something that required their full capacity. Flow has specific characteristics that distinguish it from ordinary engagement. First, there's a clear goal structure. You know what you're trying to accomplish. Second, there's immediate feedback. You know whether you're succeeding or failing moment by moment. Third, and most critical, there's a balance between challenge and skill. The task pushes you to the edge of your capability, but doesn't exceed it. Too easy and you're bored. Too hard and you're anxious. Right at the boundary, flow emerges. The neural mechanisms involve several systems. The prefrontal cortex, normally active in self-monitoring and executive control, shows reduced activation during flow states. This is called transient hypofrontality, temporary reduction in frontal function. The brain regions responsible for self-awareness, for metacognition, for worrying about yourself and your performance, these quiet down. What remains is the motor cortex, sensory processing, procedural memory, the systems directly involved in executing the task. This creates the subjective experience of selflessness. Your sense of being a separate observer, watching yourself perform, diminishes or disappears. There's just the action, the immediate response to what's happening. No gap between perception and response. This is why athletes describe being in the zone, why musicians talk about the music playing itself, why surgeons report hours passing like minutes. The self as narrator has gone offline temporarily. The dopamine system is active during flow, but differently than in hedonic pleasure. Flow activates both the dorsal striatum, involved in habit and procedural learning, and the nucleus accumbens, involved in reward. But the pattern suggests intrinsic motivation rather than external reward seeking. The activity itself becomes rewarding. You're not doing it for what you'll get afterward. The doing is the point. Studies using experience sampling, where people carry devices that prompt them randomly throughout the day to report what they're doing and how they feel, show that flow experiences are among the most positive moments people report. But here's the paradox. During flow, people don't report high levels of positive emotion. The intense satisfaction comes retrospectively, in memory. While you're in flow, you're not feeling happy or unhappy. You're not feeling much about yourself at all. You're absorbed. This contradicts the naive model where happiness comes from feeling good in the moment. Flow suggests that the best experiences come from forgetting about feeling, from engagement so complete that evaluation stops. The happiness emerges afterward, when you reflect on the experience and recognize that you were fully present, fully capable, meeting a challenge that mattered. The memory is deeply satisfying, even though the moment itself wasn't characterized by pleasure. The challenge-skill balance is crucial and dynamic. As you develop skill, previously challenging tasks become easy. To maintain flow, you need to increase the challenge. This creates a natural growth trajectory. Flow pulls you toward increasing complexity, toward developing greater capabilities, because that's the only way to keep finding the edge where flow occurs. This is why flow correlates with long-term well-being. It drives development and mastery. Flow can occur in almost any activity that meets the structural requirements. Physical activities like sports, climbing, dancing provide clear goals and immediate feedback. Creative work like writing, painting, composing offers similar structure. Even mundane tasks can produce flow if you frame them right, setting internal challenges and maintaining the skill-challenge balance. Csikszentmihalyi found factory workers who turned repetitive tasks into games, creating flow in unlikely contexts. What doesn't produce flow is passive consumption. Watching television, scrolling social media, most forms of entertainment designed to be easy and pleasant, these don't meet the challenge skill requirement. They're too easy. They don't demand your full capacity. Studies show people report lower satisfaction and more apathy during passive leisure than during active, challenging pursuits, even though passive activities feel easier and more relaxing in the moment. This creates another decision gap. When you're tired, stressed, depleted, passive consumption feels appealing. It requires nothing from you, but it doesn't produce flow, doesn't lead to the satisfaction that comes from full engagement. Active pursuits that could produce flow feel effortful, require energy you don't think you have. So you choose the easier option, which feels okay in the moment, but leaves you less satisfied afterward. The neuroscience supports this. The reduced prefrontal activation during flow includes the dorsolateral regions involved in self-criticism and rumination. When those are quiet, anxiety and self-doubt fade. You're not worrying about whether you're good enough or what others think. You're just responding to the immediate demands of the task. This is why flow is therapeutic for people prone to rumination and anxiety. It interrupts the negative thought loops. Flow also alters time perception, mediated by changes in dopamine and norepinephrine signaling. High levels of engagement compress subjective time. Hours feel like minutes. This is distinct from boredom, which expands time. The compression happens because you're not checking the clock, not monitoring yourself, not creating the meta-level awareness that normally segments experience into discrete moments. everything blurs into continuous action. There's an addictive quality to flow. People who experience it regularly seek it out, organize their lives around activities that produce it. This isn't pathological addiction. It's what Csikszentmihalyi calls autotelic experience, activity valued for its own sake rather than for external rewards. Flow is intrinsically rewarding in a way that doesn't require escalation or produce tolerance. The activity remains engaging because the challenge can always increase as skill develops. This might be the closest thing to sustainable happiness the brain produces. Not because flow feels happy in the conventional sense, but because it produces deep satisfaction without requiring circumstances to stay favorable, desires to be met, or comparisons to work out in your favor. Flow comes from engagement, from matching your capacity to a worthy challenge, from forgetting yourself in action. These conditions can be created deliberately through choice of activity and adjustment of difficulty. The limitation is that flow requires capacity. When you're depleted, depressed, anxious, finding flow becomes harder. The challenges feel overwhelming rather than optimal. Your skills feel inadequate. The balance tips toward anxiety, and flow doesn't emerge. This means flow is more accessible to people with resources, physical and mental health, environments that allow for challenging engagement. It's not equally available to everyone. Still, the principle suggests a strategy fundamentally different from hedonic pursuit. Instead of seeking experiences that feel good, seek activities that demand your full capacity. Instead of trying to be happy, try to be absorbed. Instead of focusing on outcomes, focus on the process of meeting challenges at the edge of your ability. The satisfaction comes not from getting what you want, but from becoming capable of meeting difficulty with skill. Flow reveals that the self, the constant narrator and evaluator, isn't necessary for experience and might actually interfere with the best experiences. When you stop watching yourself, stop judging yourself, stop thinking about whether you're happy, and just engage fully with what's in front of you, something better than happiness emerges. Not pleasure, not satisfaction of desire, but complete presence. And presence, unlike pleasure, doesn't adapt. The more you practice it, the more accessible it becomes. Flow might not last in individual moments, but the capacity for flow can deepen over time. That capacity is closer to what lasts than anything involving feeling good. Humans are social animals at the level of neurobiology, not just culture. Your brain contains dedicated systems for bonding, attachment, and connection that operate independently of the reward circuits we've discussed. These systems produce a different kind of well-being, one that shows resistance to the adaptation mechanisms that erode hedonic pleasure. The research here is clear and convergent. The quality of your relationships predicts your long-term happiness more strongly than almost anything else, and the mechanisms explain why this form of happiness is more durable. The neurochemistry starts with oxytocin and vasopressin, neuropeptides involved in social bonding across mammalian species. In humans, oxytocin is released during physical contact, sex, childbirth, breastfeeding, and also during positive social interactions like hugging, eye contact, and supportive conversation. It activates receptors throughout the brain, particularly in regions involved in emotion regulation, stress response, and social cognition. The effect isn't simple pleasure. It's a recalibration of threat detection and affiliation motivation. When oxytocin levels rise, the amygdala's response to social threat decreases. You become less vigilant, more willing to trust, more inclined to approach rather than avoid. The system is facilitating bonding by temporarily lowering the defenses that normally keep you cautious around others. This is why oxytocin is sometimes called the trust hormone, though that oversimplifies. It's not making you universally trusting. It's modulating social perception in ways that support attachment. Vasopressin works similarly, but appears more involved in pair bonding and long-term attachment, particularly in males. Animal studies, especially with prairie voles, which form monogamous pair bonds, show that vasopressin receptor density predicts bonding behavior. Block the receptors and pair bonding fails. Increase receptor activation and bonding strengthens. The human studies are less direct, but the same systems appear to function similarly. There's also the endogenous opioid system, which we discussed earlier in relation to hedonic pleasure, but it plays a crucial role in social bonding too. Mu-opioid receptors in brain regions, including the nucleus accumbens, respond to social connection. This is why social isolation is painful, literally activating some of the same neural networks as physical pain. Social connection soothes both physical and emotional pain through opioid-mediated mechanisms. The attachment system develops early and shapes lifelong patterns. Infants form attachments to caregivers through repeated interactions where needs are met, distress is soothed, and safety is provided. This creates internal working models of relationships, expectations about whether others will be available and responsive. Secure attachment in childhood predicts better relationship quality and higher well-being in adulthood. The early patterns persist because they're encoded in neural circuits that are difficult to completely rewire. But here's what matters for our purposes. Unlike dopamine-based rewards, attachment bonds don't show the same degree of hedonic adaptation. You don't habituate to your long-term partner the way you habituate to a new car or a higher salary. The relationship changes, intensity may decrease, but the bond itself provides stable well-being that doesn't fade according to the same timeline as pleasure-based rewards. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running longitudinal studies in psychology, tracked individuals for over 80 years, from adolescence through old age. The single strongest predictor of happiness, health, and longevity wasn't career success, wealth, fame, or health habits. It was relationship quality. People with strong, satisfying relationships in midlife were happier and healthier decades later. Those with poor relationships showed worse outcomes across virtually every measure. The mechanism appears to involve stress buffering. Good relationships reduce physiological stress responses. When you have secure attachments, your HPA axis doesn't spike as high in response to stressors, and it returns to baseline faster. This means less chronic cortisol exposure, less wear and tear on the body, better immune function, lower inflammation. The relationships literally protect you at a biological level, and this protection accumulates over decades. Social isolation produces the opposite effect. Loneliness activates stress responses, increases inflammation, impairs sleep, accelerates cognitive decline. The effects are comparable to smoking or obesity in terms of mortality risk. This isn't just about feeling lonely. It's about the absence of attachment bonds triggering biological systems that assume danger, because in ancestral environments, being alone meant vulnerability to threats. Your body responds to social isolation as an emergency even in modern contexts where you're physically safe. The quality matters more than quantity. Having many acquaintances doesn't produce the same benefits as having a few close relationships. The attachment system isn't satisfied by superficial connection. It requires depth, reciprocity, reliability, the sense that someone knows you and cares about your well-being. This is why social media connection doesn't substitute for in-person relationships. It engages different neural systems and doesn't activate the attachment machinery as strongly. There's an interesting asymmetry. Relationships can be a source of chronic stress if they're conflicted or abusive. Bad relationships might be worse for well-being than no relationships. The attachment system evolved in contexts where group membership was essential for survival, but group conflict was also dangerous. When relationships are unpredictable or hostile, the attachment system generates anxiety rather than security, and chronic relationship stress produces cumulative damage. Romantic relationships show specific neurobiological patterns. Early-stage romantic love activates reward circuits intensely, including dopamine-rich areas like the ventral tegmental area. Brain scans of people shown photos of new romantic partners look similar to brain scans of people on cocaine. This intense activation fades over time, which is why the early intensity of romantic love doesn't last. But it can transition into attachment-based bonding mediated by oxytocin and vasopressin. This transition is where many relationships fail. The early dopamine-driven intensity feels like love. When it fades, people often assume the relationship has failed, that they've fallen out of love. But the fading of that intensity is normal, even adaptive. What can replace it is deeper attachment, which feels different, less exciting but more stable, producing well-being through security and connection rather than through intensity and novelty. Studies of long-term couples show that relationship satisfaction predicts individual well-being years later. It's bidirectional. Happier people maintain better relationships, but the relationship quality has independent effects. Being in a satisfying long-term relationship provides a buffer against the hedonic adaptation that affects most other life domains. The relationship doesn't become neutral background the way a salary or a house does. It remains a source of meaning and support. Friendships operate similarly. Close friendships in adulthood predict happiness and health, though they're harder to maintain than family relationships, because they require ongoing effort without institutional or biological ties to sustain them. Still, people with strong friendships show better well-being across multiple measures. The mechanism is likely similar: stress buffering, sense of belonging, mutual support during difficulties. There's also the concept of social integration, the extent to which you're embedded in a network of relationships and community connections. This predicts health and longevity, even controlling for close relationships. Being part of something larger, having a sense of belonging to a community, activates systems related to identity and meaning. It's not just about individual bonds, but about feeling located in a social world. The challenge is that modern life makes maintaining relationships harder. Geographic mobility separates people from family and childhood friends. Work demands reduce time for socializing. Digital communication substitutes for in-person contact. The result is increasing reports of loneliness, even as superficial connectivity increases. The attachment system isn't being fed adequately because the kind of connection it requires, regular, in-person, emotionally present interaction, is declining. Investing in relationships requires time and energy that could go toward career, achievement, or pleasure-seeking. But the returns are different. Career achievement adapts. Pleasure fades. Relationships provide sustained well-being that doesn't follow the same adaptation curve. The attachment bonds accumulate rather than erode. A 20-year friendship is richer than a 2-year friendship, in ways that a higher salary isn't richer than the satisfaction from the salary you had before. This makes relationships one of the few areas where the hedonic treadmill doesn't fully apply. Not because relationships don't change or present challenges, but because the neurobiological systems supporting them are built for long-term bonding, rather than novelty seeking. The oxytocin and vasopressin systems create stable attachments that persist through habituation. The sense of security and belonging they provide doesn't require constant novelty or escalation. If you're asking what lasts, what produces well-being resistant to adaptation, the answer includes this: connection to other humans through bonds that activate your attachment system. Not networking, not having many followers, not being popular. Deep, reciprocal relationships where you're known and valued, where you provide support and receive it, where your nervous system learns that you're not alone. That kind of connection, maintained over time, provides something closer to durable happiness than almost anything else available to human experience. The direct pursuit of happiness often produces less happiness than pursuing something else entirely. This is another paradox, and it has a resolution in what psychologists call psychological flexibility. The capacity to experience thoughts and feelings without being controlled by them. To choose actions based on values rather than on attempts to avoid discomfort or manufacture good feelings. The research here, particularly from acceptance and commitment therapy, suggests that struggling less with internal experience and committing more to valued action produces more stable life satisfaction than happiness seeking itself. The core problem is experiential avoidance, the tendency to try to escape, suppress, or control unwanted internal experiences like anxiety, sadness, self-doubt, or discomfort. This seems reasonable. Why wouldn't you try to reduce negative feelings? But the research shows that attempts to control internal states often backfire. The effort to suppress thoughts makes them more intrusive. The attempt to avoid anxiety triggers more anxiety about the anxiety. Fighting your internal experience creates additional suffering on top of them. Original discomfort. This happens because your brain's threat detection systems interpret the avoidance itself as evidence of danger. If you're working hard to avoid feeling anxious, your amygdala concludes anxiety must be dangerous, which increases vigilance for anxiety, which makes you more likely to notice and react to anxious feelings. The avoidance maintains and amplifies what it's trying to eliminate. This is the anxiety avoidance cycle, well documented in clinical psychology, but it applies to other emotions too. Happiness seeking can become a form of experiential avoidance. If you're constantly trying to feel happy, constantly evaluating whether you're happy enough, constantly pursuing experiences and circumstances that should make you happy, you're implicitly treating not happiness as a problem to be solved. This creates a meta level of suffering. You're not just experiencing normal variation in mood, you're experiencing the distress of failing to be happy enough. The anxiety that your life isn't producing the feelings it should. The alternative is acceptance. Not in the sense of resignation, but in the sense of willingness to experience whatever arises without struggle. This doesn't mean you like negative emotions or that you don't take action to improve circumstances. It means you stop fighting the internal experience itself. You notice anxiety without trying to make it go away. You acknowledge sadness without treating it as a failure. You allow the full range of human emotion without evaluating yourself based on whether you're feeling good. This is harder than it sounds because your mind constantly generates evaluations and comparisons. The prefrontal cortex is always assessing, judging, problem-solving. Telling yourself to stop struggling often just creates more struggle. Acceptance requires a different relationship with thinking itself, recognizing thoughts as mental events rather than facts, noticing when your mind is narrating and evaluating without taking every thought as truth or command. Mindfulness practices train this capacity. When you meditate, you practice noticing thoughts and sensations without reacting to them, without trying to change them, without getting absorbed in the narratives they generate. This isn't about achieving a blank mind. It's about developing the ability to observe your mental activity with some distance, recognizing that thoughts and feelings are temporary events, not permanent truths about you or your life. The neural mechanisms involve prefrontal regulation of limbic reactivity. Regular mindfulness practice strengthens connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, improving your capacity to regulate emotional responses. It also increases activity in the insula, which processes interoceptive awareness, your sense of what's happening in your body. Better interoceptive awareness allows you to notice emotional states earlier and with more clarity, which paradoxically makes them easier to accept rather than harder. But acceptance alone isn't enough. The second component is values-based action, choosing what you do based on what matters to you, rather than on what feels good or what reduces discomfort. Values in this context aren't goals or outcomes, they're directions, ongoing qualities you want to embody. Being a caring parent, contributing through your work, creating beauty, pursuing growth. These are values. They don't have endpoints. You can always move toward them, regardless of circumstances or feelings. The distinction matters because goals activate the reward system and are subject to hedonic adaptation. You achieve the goal, you feel good briefly, then you adapt and need a new goal. Values don't work this way. You can't achieve being a caring parent. You can only keep acting in ways consistent with that value. Each action is meaningful in itself, not as a step towards some future completion. This provides ongoing purpose without the adaptation that undermines goal achievement. Values-based action often requires doing difficult things, experiencing discomfort, choosing effort over ease. If you value creative expression, but creating involves frustration and self-doubt, values-based action means creating anyway, not because it feels good, but because it aligns with what matters. If you value connection, but relationships require vulnerability and risk, values-based action means engaging despite fear. This is where psychological flexibility comes in. You need acceptance to tolerate the discomfort that values-based action often involves. Without acceptance, you'll avoid the difficult emotions and default to easier, more comfortable choices that don't align with your values. With acceptance, you can feel anxious and still act courageously, feel sad and still engage with life, feel uncertain and still commit to meaningful action. Research on ACT shows that psychological flexibility predicts well-being independently of symptom reduction. People can be anxious or depressed and still have high life satisfaction if they're living according to their values, despite the symptoms. Conversely, people with low symptoms can have low life satisfaction if they're avoiding challenges and not engaging with what matters. The quality of your actions matters more than the quality of your feelings. This runs completely counter to the happiness pursuit model. Instead of trying to arrange circumstances to produce good feelings, you identify what you value and act accordingly regardless of feelings. Instead of treating negative emotions as problems to be solved, you treat them as normal parts of being human that don't need to control your behavior. The result is a different kind of well-being, more stable because it doesn't depend on circumstances or emotional states staying favorable. Longitudinal studies support this. People who score high on psychological flexibility show more stable life satisfaction over time. They're less affected by negative life events because they maintain values-based action even during difficulty. They're less prone to hedonic adaptation from positive events because their well-being comes from what they're doing, not from what they're getting. The mechanism is behavioral. They keep engaging in meaningful activity regardless of circumstances. There's a neurobiological correlate. Values-based action activates prefrontal regions associated with self-regulation and goal-directed behavior, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex involved in value computation and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex involved in cognitive control. These regions support sustained engagement with difficult tasks and override of immediate impulses in favor of longer-term priorities. Strengthening these circuits through practice makes values-based action easier and more automatic. The process isn't pleasant. Acceptance means experiencing negative emotions fully, rather than numbing or distracting. Values-based action means choosing difficulty when ease is available. Neither feels good in the hedonic sense, but both produce a sense of coherence, of living in integrity with yourself, of doing what matters despite obstacles. That sense appears more satisfying long-term than hedonic pleasure, and it doesn't adapt the way pleasure does. This suggests that the question, "How can I be happier?" might be the wrong question. The better question might be, "What do I value, and am I living accordingly?" If the answer is yes, if you're acting in line with what matters despite difficulty and discomfort, you're likely to experience life satisfaction that persists. If the answer is no, if you're organizing your life around comfort and pleasure-seeking and avoiding difficulty, you're likely to stay on the hedonic treadmill regardless of what you achieve or acquire. The implication is deeply practical. You can stop fighting your internal experience. You can notice thoughts and feelings without treating them as truths or commands. You can choose actions based on values rather than on whether they'll make you feel good. This doesn't guarantee happiness in the conventional sense. It might not even increase positive emotion much. But it provides something more durable. A life organized around meaning and chosen direction, rather than around the futile attempt to feel good all the time. Psychological flexibility is trainable. You can practice acceptance through mindfulness. You can clarify your values through reflection and writing. You can commit to small actions aligned with those values and notice what happens. None of this is easy, and it doesn't produce the dramatic emotional payoff that getting what you want produces. But it produces stability. It produces the sense that your life means something regardless of how you feel. And that sense, that grounding in values and willingness to experience whatever arises, that's closer to what lasts than happiness as usually understood.